"Sir, you can't sit here. This section is for first class only." The single father looked up from his daughter's backpack, fingers still holding the zipper halfway closed. Around him, polished leather seats glowed beneath soft cabin lighting, while the quiet hum of the aircraft systems vibrated through the floor. A sharply dressed woman stood in the aisle beside a tall executive whose expression carried the unmistakable weight of someone used to giving orders. "This seat costs more than your entire ticket," the executive said coldly, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "People who didn't pay for it don't belong here." Passengers turned. Some are curious, some were amused. The moment stretched long enough for humiliation to settle into the air like turbulence before a storm. The father didn't argue. He simply lifted the worn backpack, took his daughter's small hand, and stepped into the aisle. 2 minutes later, the cockpit door opened and the pilot walked out. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. Because this wasn't really about a seat on an airplane. It was about what happens when the quietest person in the room knows something everyone else desperately needs. The aircraft engines roared louder as the boarding process neared its end, and the father guided his daughter carefully down the aisle toward economy. No anger, no protest, just calm. Caleb Rourke had learned years ago that pride was useless in moments like this. His daughter Lena looked up at him with wide eyes. "Dad, did we do something wrong?" Caleb crouched slightly beside her seat row, setting the backpack on the floor. "No, kiddo," he said softly. "Sometimes people just forget how to see others properly." She studied his face as if weighing that answer. Lena had grown up watching her father handle worse things than rude strangers. She had seen him fix broken heaters in winter, patch leaking pipes in old apartments, and somehow stretch a paycheck that never seemed large enough. But even she had noticed something strange about him. Caleb always seemed to understand machines in ways other adults didn't. As the father settled into the narrow economy seat, he instinctively glanced toward the overhead panel where indicator lights blinked softly. The vibration of the engines carried subtle variations. Most passengers never noticed. He did. Always. A faint whine traveled through the aircraft structure, almost hidden beneath the roar of takeoff preparations. Caleb's brow tightened slightly. Not fear, recognition. Up front, in the luxury section he'd just left, Victor Halstead leaned comfortably into his wide leather seat while accepting a glass of sparkling water from the attendant. "That sort of thing happens too often," Halstead said to the passengers nearby. "Airlines need to maintain standards." A man across the aisle chuckled. "Well, you certainly made your point," Halstead smirked. Behind the curtain separating first class from economy, the hum of the aircraft changed pitch for a fraction of a second. Caleb's head tilted. Lena noticed. "You hear that, too?" She whispered. He smiled faintly. "Yeah, I did." The sound faded again beneath the steady roar of engines. Cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft doors sealed and the plane prepared to push back from the gate. Passengers buckled their belts. The safety announcement began overhead. Caleb leaned back, folding his arms loosely, though his eyes remained fixed on the ceiling panel where a small amber indicator blinked once, then disappeared. A coincidence, maybe. Or maybe not. In first class, Halstead raised his glass again. To smooth flights, he joked. The plane began rolling slowly toward the runway. In economy, Lena curled against her father's arm. "You think this trip's going to be okay?" she asked. Caleb looked toward the cockpit door far ahead. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then he gave a quiet nod. "Yeah," he said. But his eyes had already returned to the ceiling. Listening. Waiting. Because something inside the aircraft's electrical systems had just whispered a warning most people would never hear. And Caleb Rourke had spent years of his life learning exactly what those whispers meant. The plane surged forward, engines climbing into a powerful roar as the runway lights streaked past the windows. Lena gripped the armrest, eyes wide with excitement. Caleb rested a reassuring hand over hers. "You're okay," he murmured. "Just the takeoff roll." The aircraft lifted smoothly into the night sky, the city lights below shrinking into scattered constellations beneath the wings. Around them, passengers relaxed back into their seats as the familiar climb settled into a steady ascent. But Caleb didn't fully relax. His gaze drifted again toward the overhead panel. A small amber light blinked, once, then vanished. Most people wouldn't have noticed. He did. The sound returned too, a faint vibration buried inside the deeper roar of the engines. Not loud, not alarming, just wrong. He shifted slightly in his seat. Lena noticed. "You're doing the thing again," she whispered. "What thing?" "The listening thing." Caleb chuckled quietly. "Guess I am." Up ahead, beyond the curtain dividing the cabin, first class carried on like a floating lounge above the clouds. Glasses clinked. Soft conversation drifted back occasionally. Victor Halstead leaned comfortably in his wide seat, clearly enjoying himself. "You'd be surprised how often people try to sneak up here," he was telling another passenger nearby. "Airlines rely on passengers like us to keep order." The businessman across the aisle nodded. "Still," the man said, "that guy didn't look like trouble." Halstead waved the thought away. "It's not about trouble," he replied. "It's about standards." Behind the curtain, Caleb exhaled slowly. The aircraft leveled slightly as it continued climbing. Another vibration flickered through the cabin floor. Subtle, but his attention sharpened immediately. He leaned toward the window, watching the wing. No visible issues. Still, his fingers tapped lightly against the armrest as he counted seconds between the vibrations. 1, 2, 3. There, another pulse. The overhead speaker chimed softly as the seatbelt sign turned off. Passengers began shifting, opening bags, stretching legs. Lena unbuckled and pulled a small notebook from her backpack. "Can I draw?" she asked. "Go for it." She began sketching the airplane cabin with careful concentration. Meanwhile, Caleb kept listening. A flight attendant walked down the aisle offering drinks. "Something for you?" she asked warmly. "Just water," Caleb said. As she handed him the cup, another vibration hummed through the floor. The attendant didn't react. Why would she? But Caleb noticed the timing again. Not random. Patterned. Electrical systems often behaved like that when components began slipping out of synchronization. He glanced upward again. Nothing obvious now. Still, he filed the observation away. Across the cabin, a passenger laughed loudly at a joke from a seatmate. Someone else reclined their chair with a satisfied sigh. To them, it was just another flight. To Caleb, it was beginning to feel like the opening lines of a technical problem. He took a sip of water. "Dad," Lena whispered suddenly. "Yeah? You're doing math in your head again." He smiled faintly. "Maybe a little." She studied him carefully. "You always do that when something's broken." The quiet observation made him pause. Kids noticed more than adults realized. "Well," he said gently, "nothing's broken right now," he hoped. Because the pattern he'd heard before, years ago, usually meant something deeper inside the aircraft's electrical architecture was misbehaving, and problems like that rarely announced themselves politely. They escalated. The cabin lights flickered for a split second. Passengers barely reacted. Some didn't notice at all. But Caleb did. His eyes lifted instantly. There it was again, that whisper inside the machine. A nearby passenger frowned at the lights. Did that just flicker? Probably turbulence, someone else said dismissively. But Caleb knew better. Turbulence didn't flicker lights. Electrical instability did. He leaned back slowly, expression calm despite the calculations quietly running through his mind. Years ago, he had spent long nights inside aircraft maintenance hangars listening to sounds exactly like this, learning what they meant, learning how quickly they could spiral. The engines droned steadily as the aircraft climbed higher into the darkness. Far ahead, the cockpit door remained closed. Inside, the pilots were likely watching instruments carefully. But if the issue was what Caleb suspected, they might not see it yet. Not until it became impossible to ignore. Lena finished her drawing and held it up proudly. "Look," she said. The sketch showed rows of passengers, the airplane window, and the wings stretching across the sky. But she had also drawn something else. Her father. Listening. Caleb smiled softly. "You made my ears too big, you need them," she replied. He chuckled. Maybe she was right, because somewhere deep inside the aircraft's electrical network something had just shifted again. And this time, the vibration didn't fade, it lingered, low, persistent, like a warning clearing its throat. Before long, the entire plane would hear it. And when they did, someone was going to need to understand exactly what it meant. Don't forget to subscribe with the bell on, because stories like this remind us that the quietest people often carry the greatest strength. The vibration didn't disappear. It stayed beneath the steady roar of the engines, subtle but persistent like a loose thread running through a perfectly woven machine. Most passengers were too busy settling into their flights to notice anything unusual. But Caleb did. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of the aircraft wash over him. Engines, airflow, cabin circulation, and beneath it all, that faint electrical tremor again. His fingers tapped slowly against the armrest as he counted the rhythm. Not random. Never random. Lena leaned toward him, whispering so the passengers around them wouldn't hear. Still doing the listening thing? He opened one eye and smiled. "Yeah, what's it saying?" Caleb hesitated. He didn't want to worry her, but he also knew Lena preferred honesty. It's saying something in the plane isn't perfectly happy. Her eyes widened slightly. Like when the washing machine made that clunky sound before it broke? Something like that. She looked around the cabin. Nobody else seemed concerned. Passengers were opening snacks, watching movies, or chatting casually with seatmates. A man 2 rows ahead had already fallen asleep, mouth slightly open. Normal flight, except Caleb knew machines better than people sometimes, and machines rarely whispered without reason. Ahead of them, the curtain separating first class shifted slightly as a flight attendant stepped through. The smell of fresh coffee drifted into economy. Behind that curtain, the atmosphere was entirely different. Victor Halstead reclined comfortably, scrolling through messages on his phone while enjoying the quiet luxury of the first-class cabin. "Beautiful climb tonight," a passenger beside him said. Halstead nodded approvingly. "Smooth operations," he replied. "That's what happens when professionals run things." The other man chuckled, still thinking about that passenger earlier. Halstead smirked. "I just don't like seeing rules ignored." He took a slow sip of his drink, clearly satisfied with the outcome. Back in economy, another flicker passed through the overhead lights. This one lasted barely a heartbeat. But 3 passengers noticed. A woman across the aisle glanced up. Did anyone else see that? "Probably nothing," the man beside her replied. Caleb didn't move. His eyes were already fixed on the ceiling panel again. That amber indicator blinked once more, then vanished. He exhaled quietly. That confirmed it. Electrical synchronization instability. Rare, but not unheard of. If it continued drifting out of alignment, the aircraft's avionics systems could begin miscommunicating with each other. Navigation. Autopilot. flight management computers. Most modern planes had redundancies to handle it, but if the fault spread, he rubbed the back of his neck slowly. Years ago, he had watched a similar fault cascade across a system panel in a military hangar. It hadn't ended well. Lena watched his expression carefully. "You're thinking hard again, just remembering stuff, important stuff?" He nodded slightly. Maybe a soft chime echoed through the cabin. Passengers looked up. The seatbelt sign blinked on again. A moment later, the captain's voice came through the overhead speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing a minor technical irregularity and will be keeping the seatbelt sign on for the moment while we run a quick systems check. Everything is under control." The announcement ended with a reassuring chime. Passengers exchanged small looks. Nothing alarming, just routine. Except Caleb noticed the exact word the pilot had used. Irregularity. That usually meant the system was reporting something inconsistent, something the flight computers couldn't neatly categorize. The vibration hummed again through the floor. Longer this time. He tilted his head slightly. Counting. Tracking. Across the aisle, a businessman frowned. "Strange," the man muttered. "What is?" his seatmate asked. "The engines feel uneven." Most people would dismiss that feeling as imagination, but Caleb didn't. Because it matched the timing perfectly. Electrical instability affecting sensor feedback could easily produce uneven engine management signals. If that happened long enough, the flight computers might start rejecting navigation inputs. And once that started, the pilots would be forced to troubleshoot fast. Very fast. Another chime echoed, this time louder. Passengers began murmuring quietly. A flight attendant hurried toward the front of the plane. The cockpit door remained firmly closed, but something had clearly changed. Caleb leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees as he focused on the sounds again. The aircraft's systems were talking. He just happened to understand their language. Up front in first class, Halstead frowned as the plane shuddered faintly beneath his feet. "That doesn't feel routine," the passenger beside him said. Halstead glanced toward the cockpit door. For the first time since takeoff, his confident expression wavered slightly. Back in economy, Lena squeezed her father's arm. "Dad? Yeah? Is the plane okay?" Caleb listened one more time. The vibration deepened. Then came a sharper electronic chime from somewhere forward. Not a passenger chime, a system alert. His jaw tightened slightly. "Something's definitely trying to tell them a story up there," he murmured. "What kind of story?" Caleb looked toward the cockpit door again. The kind pilots really don't like hearing. At that exact moment, the cockpit door unlocked with a sharp mechanical click, and for the first time since takeoff, the pilot stepped out into the cabin. The cockpit door opened just a few inches at first. Passengers closest to the front noticed immediately. Conversation softened, curiosity spreading through the first few rows like a ripple moving across still water. Then the door swung wider. Captain Mirella Kovac stepped into the cabin. Her uniform was perfectly composed, but her eyes were sharp, scanning the space with focused urgency that experienced travelers instantly recognized. Something wasn't routine. Behind her, the cockpit instruments cast a faint glow through the open doorway before the door shut again with a quiet click. A flight attendant hurried forward. "Captain?" Kovac spoke quietly, but the tension in her voice carried. "System disagreement between the avionics buses," she said. "We're troubleshooting." The attendant nodded and moved quickly down the aisle. Passengers in first class exchanged uneasy looks. Victor Halstead leaned forward in his seat. "What exactly does that mean?" he asked. The attendant gave a practiced smile. "Just a precautionary check, sir," but even Halstead could see the difference between routine calm and controlled concern. Back in economy, Caleb had already straightened in his seat the moment the cockpit door opened. The pilot's words confirmed it. Avionics buses. Electrical synchronization failure. The exact problem he'd suspected. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, listening more carefully now. The vibration had grown stronger, not violent, but steady, persistent. Lena noticed immediately. "Dad, you're doing the serious listening now." He nodded slowly. Yeah, the overhead lights flickered again. This time longer. Passengers murmured louder. Across the aisle someone whispered, "That can't be good." Another electronic chime echoed from the front of the aircraft. Not part of the passenger system. A sharper tone. Inside the cockpit, instruments were likely flashing caution alerts now. Caleb could practically picture the panels. He had spent thousands of hours staring at similar systems years ago. Electrical buses carried power between the aircraft's major avionics computers. If one bus drifted out of synchronization, computers could begin arguing with each other about navigation data. When that happened, autopilot could disengage. Flight management systems could reject commands, and pilots would suddenly find themselves flying a very complicated machine without reliable electronic assistance. Lena leaned closer. "You know what that sound means, don't you?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched the curtain at the front of the cabin shift again as the flight attendant returned from speaking with the captain. Passengers were beginning to notice now. A man near the aisle asked nervously, "Is everything okay?" The attendant kept her smile. "The crew is handling a minor systems issue." Minor. Caleb almost smiled. Aviation had a funny way of defining that word. He leaned back slightly, thinking through the sequence. If the buses were drifting apart electrically, the pilots would try isolating one system. Then they'd reboot a secondary avionics controller. But if the root cause was deeper, they'd start losing navigation alignment. Another vibration rolled through the floor, stronger now. He counted again. 3 seconds. Then 5. Then another flicker. The pattern was accelerating. Up front, Victor Halstead had lost some of his earlier confidence. "What exactly is going on?" he asked again. The attendant hesitated this time before answering. "The captain is verifying system data." Halstead didn't like vague answers. He leaned back, arms folded, eyes fixed on the cockpit door. Meanwhile, the cabin had grown noticeably quieter. Passengers were listening now. Just like Caleb, another alert chimed from the front. Lena squeezed his arm. "Dad." "Yeah?" "You look like you did that time the truck's brakes started making that squealing sound." He nodded slowly. "That was a good catch by you. Is this like that?" He took a slow breath. "Sort of." The cockpit door opened again. Captain Kovac stepped out once more, moving faster this time. Her gaze swept through the rows of passengers briefly, not searching for comfort. Searching for something else. Someone else. Caleb recognized that look immediately. Pilots rarely left the cockpit during a problem, unless the problem was something the aircraft's computers weren't explaining properly, unless they needed human insight from someone who understood the machine differently. She spoke quietly with the flight attendant again near the galley. Their conversation lasted only a few seconds, but Caleb caught one phrase, navigation disagreement spreading. His jaw tightened slightly. That meant the fault was migrating across the avionics network, exactly as he'd feared. Lena noticed his reaction. "Okay, now you definitely know something." He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "I might. You gonna tell them?" Caleb glanced toward the front of the plane again. The pilot stood there now, thinking hard. Troubleshooting options were probably racing through her mind, because avionics faults like this rarely gave pilots much time before systems started dropping offline. The vibration pulsed again, this time strong enough for several passengers to notice clearly. "Did the plane just shake?" someone asked. A few nervous laughs followed. Captain Kovac looked toward the rear of the aircraft briefly. Her eyes passed across dozens of faces, then paused for half a second on Caleb. He didn't wave, didn't stand, just watched quietly. Machines spoke through patterns, and he had just heard one more detail. The vibration shifted pitch. Subtle, but unmistakable. The fault wasn't just electrical anymore. It was starting to affect sensor feedback loops, which meant the aircraft's flight computers were about to become very confused. Caleb leaned forward again. Lena followed his gaze. "Dad, are you about to get involved?" He didn't answer, but his eyes had already moved to the galley near the cockpit, where the captain stood, trying to solve a puzzle, and for the first time since takeoff, she looked like someone who might need help. Captain Mirella Kovac stood in the narrow galley just outside the cockpit. One hand braced against the counter while the aircraft hummed around her. The steady vibration beneath her boots had grown slightly stronger, a subtle tremor that told her the avionics problem wasn't stabilizing. Inside the cockpit, the first officer was running another diagnostic sweep. Bus 2 still drifting, his voice came faintly through the partially open door. Kovac exhaled slowly. They had already isolated the first system and rebooted the secondary controller. Normally that would correct a disagreement between avionics buses. But this fault was behaving differently. It was spreading. Another chime echoed softly through the cockpit. The navigation display flickered. "Captain," the first officer called quietly, "the flight management system is rejecting the alignment input again." That wasn't good. She stepped back into the cockpit briefly, scanning the instrument panels. Green lines and digital numbers glowed across the displays, but several warning indicators pulsed amber now. Electrical buses arguing with each other. Navigation data drifting. If the synchronization slipped much further, the autopilot would likely disconnect, and flying blind inside a modern jet's digital architecture was never comfortable. Kovac stepped back into the galley again, mind racing through procedures. Across the cabin, passengers had grown noticeably quieter. People were watching now. They could feel the subtle changes in the aircraft's behavior, even if they didn't understand them. The vibration pulsed again, longer this time. In economy, Caleb heard it instantly. His head tilted slightly. The pitch had shifted again. That confirmed the problem was now affecting the sensor feedback loops feeding the flight computers, which meant the avionics system was about to begin rejecting navigation corrections entirely. He rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. Lena watched him carefully. "You're doing that thing again," she whispered. "What thing?" "The thinking thing that means something's really broken." He smiled faintly. "Maybe a little, but the pilots know, right? They probably know something's wrong," he said quietly. "But they might not know exactly why yet." Up front, Victor Halstead leaned toward the aisle again. Passengers around him were whispering now. "I don't like the way that vibration feels," the businessman across from him said. Halstead frowned. "I'm sure the crew has it handled," but even he couldn't ignore the tension creeping through the cabin. The cockpit door opened again. Captain Kovac stepped into the aisle, scanning the passengers more deliberately this time. Her eyes moved from face to face, not searching for panic, searching for experience. Sometimes aircraft carried off-duty pilots, occasionally engineers, once in a while even maintenance technicians, anyone who might recognize the symptoms. The vibration hummed again. Caleb heard the subtle harmonic shift immediately. That was it. The electrical drift had started feeding incorrect sensor data into the inertial reference units. Once those units lost agreement, the navigation computers would begin rejecting their own inputs, and that would cascade quickly. He leaned back, weighing the moment. He didn't like drawing attention to himself, especially after the humiliation earlier. But the pattern he was hearing now was unmistakable. The problem had passed the point where standard cockpit troubleshooting would fix it easily. Lena noticed his expression change. "Dad?" He looked down at her. "Yeah, you're about to help them, aren't you?" He hesitated. Helping would mean explaining things. Explaining would mean revealing parts of his past he rarely talked about, but if he stayed quiet, the problem might escalate into something far worse. Up front, Captain Kovac spoke quietly with the flight attendant again. "What's the cabin feeling?" she asked. "Passengers are noticing the vibration," the attendant replied. Kovac nodded. Then her gaze drifted once more down the aisle and landed on Caleb. He wasn't panicking, wasn't whispering nervously, wasn't staring at his phone like most of the others. He was listening, really listening. That caught her attention immediately. Pilots developed instincts about people the same way mechanics developed instincts about machines. Something about the calm passenger in row 23 stood out. Caleb noticed her watching him. For a moment, neither moved. Then the vibration pulsed again, stronger. Several passengers gasped quietly. Lena squeezed his arm. "Okay, that one everyone heard." He nodded. "Yeah." Across the cabin, someone muttered nervously, "That can't be normal." The captain stepped forward a few rows. Her voice remained calm, but carried clear authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're continuing to evaluate a technical issue. Everything remains under control." Caleb listened to the next vibration carefully. There, a sharp tonal spike inside the electrical signature. That was the missing clue. The fault wasn't just drifting between buses. One of the avionics controllers was feeding corrupted timing signals into the system, which meant every computer was slowly falling out of sync. He leaned forward slightly, then looked toward the captain. "Excuse me," he said quietly. The word barely carried beyond his row. But Kovac heard it. Her eyes shifted back toward him. Caleb kept his voice calm. "You might want to check the timing loop on the secondary avionics controller." The captain froze. For a brief second, the cabin went completely silent around them. Because the quiet passenger in economy had just said something only someone deeply familiar with aircraft systems would even think to suggest. Don't forget to subscribe with the bell on, because the biggest heroes often look like ordinary people sitting quietly in the back row of life. Captain Mirella Kovac didn't answer immediately. She simply looked at the man in row 23. Passengers nearby had heard the sentence too, though most of them didn't understand what it meant. The words timing loop and secondary avionics controller sounded like technical language pulled from a maintenance manual. But to a pilot, those words carried weight. Real weight, because they described a very specific part of the aircraft's electronic architecture. Kovac stepped one row closer. "Say that again," she said quietly. Caleb remained seated, voice calm. "You might want to check the synchronization timing loop on the secondary controller," he repeated. "If the buses are drifting, something could be corrupting the timing signals feeding the navigation system." The captain's eyes narrowed slightly. Not with suspicion, with recognition. Those weren't guesses. That was someone describing the problem from the inside out. "You work with avionics?" she asked. Caleb hesitated only a moment. "Used to." The vibration pulsed again through the aircraft floor. Stronger. Several passengers shifted nervously in their seats. Inside the cockpit, another alert chimed. The captain made a decision instantly. "Walk with me," she said. A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin as Caleb unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. Lena grabbed his sleeve. "Dad?" He knelt beside her quickly. "Stay right here," he said gently. "I'm just going to talk to the captain." You're fixing the plane, aren't you? A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. I'm helping them figure something out. She nodded with quiet trust. As Caleb stepped into the aisle, dozens of passengers turned to watch, some curious, some confused. A few remembering the scene earlier when he had been escorted out of first class. The curtain ahead shifted as he walked forward beside the captain. Victor Halstead saw him immediately. For a moment, he looked genuinely baffled. Wait, Halstead said aloud, sitting forward in his seat. That's the passenger from earlier. No one answered him. Because everyone was watching the same thing. The man he'd thrown out of first class was now walking toward the cockpit with the captain herself. Kovac spoke quietly as they reached the galley. What exactly are you hearing back there? She asked. Caleb leaned slightly against the counter, listening again. Another vibration hummed through the aircraft. There, he said softly. What? The drift just accelerated. She studied him carefully. How can you tell? He tapped the metal surface lightly. Electrical harmonics, he explained. The buses are slipping out of sync faster now. If the timing loop is corrupted, your flight computers are probably arguing over navigation data. Inside the cockpit, another alert chimed. Kovac exhaled. That's exactly what we're seeing. Caleb nodded. If the secondary controller is feeding corrupted timing signals, every system connected to it will slowly lose alignment. The captain crossed her arms. And the fix? Isolate the controller, he said. Then reset the timing loop before the inertial reference units drift too far apart. The first officer leaned out of the cockpit doorway. Captain, the autopilot just kicked out. Passengers felt the change instantly as the aircraft's movement shifted slightly. Not dramatic, but different. Manual control. Kovac turned back to Caleb. You weren't just guessing back there, no. What's your background? He hesitated again. It wasn't a story he told often. But the plane vibrated again beneath their feet. Time mattered now. I spent 12 years working avionics engineering in the Air Force, he said quietly. The captain blinked once. That explained everything. Specialty? She asked. Navigation systems and electrical synchronization. The first officer looked between them. You're serious? Caleb nodded once. Very. Another warning tone echoed from the cockpit. Captain, the first officer said, the navigation alignment just failed again. Kovac didn't waste another second. All right, she said firmly. Then she gestured toward the cockpit. Come take a look. A collective murmur spread through the front rows as Caleb stepped through the cockpit doorway. Passengers craned their necks. Victor Halstead stared in disbelief. The same man he had publicly humiliated 30 minutes earlier had just been invited into the cockpit of a commercial aircraft during a technical emergency. Inside the cockpit, instrument panels glowed with amber alerts. Navigation data flickered across the displays. The aircraft hummed beneath their feet. Caleb leaned forward slightly, studying the systems. And within 3 seconds, he saw the problem. The corrupted timing signal pulsed across the synchronization panel like a broken heartbeat. Exactly where he expected it. He pointed calmly. There, he said. That controller's feeding bad timing data into the system. The first officer stared at the screen. How did we miss that? Caleb's voice remained steady. Because it's hiding behind the navigation fault, Captain Kovac folded her arms thoughtfully. Can we stop it? Caleb looked at the panel again, then nodded once. Yeah, he said. But we need to move fast. The cockpit hummed with a tense, focused energy. Captain Mirella Kovac stood just behind Caleb while the first officer kept both hands firmly on the control yoke. Outside the windshield, the dark sky stretched endlessly ahead, scattered with distant stars and the faint glow of cities far below. Inside, warning lights pulsed across several panels. Navigation disagreement. Data conflict. System timing fault. All symptoms of the same deeper problem. Caleb leaned slightly closer to the avionics display. The corrupted timing signal flashed again across the synchronization panel, an irregular pulse that didn't belong. There, he said again, pointing carefully. That controller's pushing corrupted clock signals into the system. The first officer frowned. If we shut it down completely, we risk losing half the avionics. You already are, Caleb replied calmly. Another alert chimed. The navigation display flickered. The captain looked between the two men. What happens if we leave it alone? She asked. Caleb didn't hesitate. The drift spreads. How fast? Hard to say exactly, but once the inertial reference units fall too far out of sync, the flight computers will stop trusting their own data. The first officer exhaled sharply. That means no navigation. And manual flying for the rest of the flight, Caleb added. Silence settled in the cockpit for a moment. Outside the cockpit door, a few passengers in first class were standing slightly in their aisles, watching nervously. Victor Halstead leaned forward in his seat, eyes fixed on the cockpit door. He didn't like uncertainty, especially when it involved something he couldn't control. Why is that passenger up there? He muttered. A woman across the aisle whispered back, maybe he's helping. Halstead scoffed. That's ridiculous, but even he could hear the tension in the aircraft now. Inside the cockpit, Caleb traced the signal path on the panel with his finger. The controller's internal clock is drifting, he said. That's feeding bad timing into the synchronization loop. The captain nodded. If we isolate it? Then the remaining system stabilizes. And if we're wrong? Caleb gave a small shrug. Then you lose the same avionics you're about to lose anyway. The first officer let out a quiet laugh. Comforting. Caleb smiled faintly. Aircraft systems are honest like that. Another vibration rolled through the aircraft. This one stronger. Passengers in the cabin gasped softly. The first officer glanced at the display. Navigation alignment just dropped another degree. Kovac's jaw tightened. All right, she said. Walk us through it. Caleb nodded and leaned forward. First, isolate the secondary controller from the timing bus. The first officer flipped a guarded switch. A panel indicator dimmed slightly. Done. Now reset the synchronization loop before the remaining buses drift. Another set of switches clicked. The cockpit grew very quiet for a moment. Everyone watched the displays. Nothing changed. Then, the corrupted signal vanished, just like that. The first officer blinked. Well, that's promising, but Caleb shook his head slightly. Not finished yet. The captain frowned. What else? That controller's still physically connected to the avionics network, Caleb explained. If its internal clock restarts wrong, the corruption comes back. So what do we do? Caleb tapped the panel lightly. You run a timing reset on the primary loop before the system resynchronizes. The first officer's eyebrows rose. That procedure isn't even in the quick checklist. No, Caleb said calmly. It's buried in the engineering manuals. The captain studied him for a moment. You've done this before, once, he admitted. How did it end? Caleb glanced at the navigation display. It worked. The first officer laughed nervously. Good enough for me. He began entering commands into the avionics panel. Outside the cockpit, tension had spread through the entire aircraft. Passengers whispered. A few people clutched armrests tightly. In economy, Lena sat quietly in her seat, hugging her father's jacket that he'd left behind. A woman beside her asked gently, Your dad up there helping the pilots? Lena nodded proudly. He fixes machines. What kind? She thought about it for a moment. The really big ones. Up front, Victor Halstead watched the cockpit door like a hawk. His earlier confidence had vanished. Something about the situation deeply unsettled him, because the one person now inside the cockpit, the one person helping solve whatever problem this aircraft had, was the same man he had thrown out of first class less than an hour ago. Inside the cockpit, the reset command completed. The avionics system paused for a fraction of a second. Every screen froze. Then the displays flickered. Numbers recalculated. Navigation data refreshed. The corrupted timing signal did not return. The first officer leaned closer to the screen. Wait, he checked the alignment data. Then checked it again. Captain, the navigation units are stabilizing. Caleb watched the synchronization panel carefully. The harmonic vibration beneath the cockpit floor softened. The aircraft's systems were settling, like a machine finally breathing properly again. Captain Kovac allowed herself the first small smile since the problem began. Looks like we caught it. Caleb nodded slowly. Yeah. Behind them, the cockpit door remained slightly open, and beyond that doorway, dozens of passengers were still watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Because the quiet passenger who had walked forward a few minutes ago might have just saved the entire flight. Do you like this personality? For several seconds inside the cockpit, no one spoke. The avionics displays continued updating, green data scrolling smoothly across the navigation panels. The earlier amber warnings had faded one by one, replaced by stable indicators. The aircraft itself felt different too. The vibration that had pulsed through the floor for the past 20 minutes had softened into the steady, familiar hum of healthy engines and synchronized systems. The first officer leaned closer to the display, scanning the alignment numbers. Navigation drift 0.02. He murmured. He blinked once, then leaned back in his seat. Captain, we're stabilizing. Mirella Kovac crossed her arms, studying the panel carefully. Years of flying had taught her to trust instruments, but also to double-check them when something seemed almost too clean. Run another sync check, she said. The first officer tapped a few commands into the system. The avionics computers responded instantly. Synchronization complete, timing loop stable. Electrical buses aligned. The cockpit fell quiet again. Then, the captain exhaled slowly. Looks like you were right. Caleb rested his hands lightly on the edge of the panel. Looks like the controller was the culprit. The first officer shook his head in disbelief. That fault was hiding behind the navigation alerts the entire time. Caleb nodded. Timing corruption often does that. The system looks like it's arguing with itself, but really it's just being fed bad information. Kovac studied him again. You diagnosed that from a seat in economy. He shrugged. I've listened to that kind of problem before. Another soft chime sounded as the aircraft's autopilot system re-engaged. The plane's motion smoothed out almost instantly. The first officer grinned. Well, that's the nicest sound I've heard tonight. Behind them, the cockpit door remained slightly open. Passengers in the first few rows were still watching quietly. Some had noticed the shift in the aircraft's movement. Others had simply been waiting for any sign that the crew was back in control. In first class, Victor Halstead leaned forward, staring toward the cockpit with growing unease. What's taking so long? He muttered. The businessman across the aisle replied softly, Looks like they're fixing something. Halstead scoffed, but the confidence in his voice had weakened. Passengers shouldn't be involved in cockpit procedures. The man raised an eyebrow. Well, if that passenger just helped stabilize the plane, I'm not complaining. Halstead said nothing. Because he could feel it too now. The plane had stopped vibrating. In economy, Lena noticed the difference instantly. She looked up at the woman beside her. The shaking stopped. The woman smiled. I think your dad might have helped. Lena hugged the jacket tighter. He always fixes things. Back in the cockpit, Captain Kovac ran one final systems check across the avionics network. Everything aligned perfectly. Navigation data locked, flight management system stable, timing signals clean. She turned toward Caleb. "I'd like you to stay here another minute while we confirm the system holds." Of course, the first officer chuckled quietly. "You realize most passengers never get invited up here." Caleb smiled faintly. "I figured." The cockpit instruments continued glowing calmly. No more alerts. No more irregular signals. The aircraft was flying normally again. Outside the cockpit, whispers spread through the front rows as passengers realized the tension had lifted. A few people even clapped quietly. Others simply relaxed back into their seats, relief washing through the cabin. Victor Halstead remained stiff in his chair. Because now he understood something very uncomfortable. The man he had thrown out of first class was the same man who had just helped stabilize the aircraft carrying everyone on board. Inside the cockpit, Captain Kovac finally nodded with satisfaction. "That should do it." The first officer leaned back, stretching his shoulders. Well, that was exciting. Caleb stepped away from the panel slightly. Glad the system cooperated. The captain turned toward him. "You didn't just help us," she said quietly. "You probably prevented a full navigation failure." He shrugged again. "Just pointed you in the right direction." Kovac shook her head. "Don't be modest." "You saw something we missed." She glanced toward the cabin through the partially open door. Passengers were still watching. Some curious, some grateful, all unaware of how close the situation had come to becoming something far worse. Then she looked back at Caleb. "What do you say we tell the passengers what really happened?" He hesitated slightly. Public attention had never been something he enjoyed. But before he could answer, the captain smiled knowingly. "Trust me," she said. "I think they'd like to know who helped keep them flying tonight." Captain Mirella Kovac stepped back from the instrument panel and reached for the overhead communication switch. Outside the cockpit, the cabin had settled into a strange, quiet anticipation. Passengers weren't panicking anymore, the aircraft's motion had smoothed out, but people still sensed that something unusual had happened. The cockpit door remained slightly open, enough for the first few rows to see Caleb standing beside the captain, and enough for Victor Halstead to watch every second of it. The captain pressed the switch. A soft chime echoed through the aircraft's speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." The entire cabin grew still. Earlier, we experienced a technical issue within the aircraft's avionics systems. While the situation remained under control, it required immediate troubleshooting to prevent further complications. Passengers listened carefully. Kovac glanced briefly toward Caleb before continuing. "I'm pleased to inform you the issue has now been fully stabilized." A wave of relief moved through the aircraft. Some passengers clapped softly, others leaned back with long exhalations. But the captain wasn't finished. "And I want to acknowledge something important," she said. Her voice carried calm authority now. "During the troubleshooting process, one of our passengers identified the root cause of the system fault and helped guide us to a solution." The words spread through the cabin like a ripple. Passengers began looking around. Who? Who had helped? Inside the cockpit doorway, Caleb shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Kovac continued. Mr. Caleb Rourke, a former Air Force avionics engineer, provided the technical insight that allowed us to stabilize the navigation systems quickly. Gasps and murmurs erupted through the first-class cabin. Several passengers turned immediately toward the cockpit door. Others leaned into the aisle trying to catch a glimpse. In economy, Lena sat upright instantly. "That's my dad," she whispered proudly. The woman beside her smiled. "I thought so." Near the front of the plane, Victor Halstead sat frozen. The words echoed in his mind. Former Air Force avionics engineer. The same man he had publicly dismissed less than an hour ago. The same man he had declared didn't belong in first class. Now that man had just been credited with helping solve the aircraft's technical emergency. Halstead's face tightened slightly. Across the aisle, the businessman who had spoken earlier looked at him. Well, the man said quietly, "That's something." Halstead said nothing, because suddenly the earlier confrontation felt very different. Back in the cockpit, Captain Kovac released the switch and let the cabin noise settle again. Caleb rubbed the back of his neck. "You didn't have to announce that." "Yes, I did," she replied. Passengers deserved to know how close they'd come to a bigger problem, and who had helped solve it. The first officer glanced toward the door. "They're already talking about it." Indeed they were. Passengers in first class whispered to one another. Some nodded respectfully. Others looked toward the cockpit with new curiosity. A few even began clapping again. The applause spread slowly through the front rows, not loud, but sincere. Caleb shifted his weight slightly, clearly wishing the attention would fade. "I should probably get back to my seat," he said. Kovac studied him for a moment. "You will," she said, "but there's one more thing." He raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" She nodded toward the open cockpit door. "Those passengers out there, some of them watched you get escorted out of first class earlier." Caleb didn't respond. He remembered the moment very clearly. The humiliation, the whispers, his daughter watching it all. Kovac continued. "And now they're watching you walk out of the cockpit." The first officer grinned slightly. "That's a pretty dramatic reversal." Caleb let out a quiet breath. "I'm not here for revenge." "I know," the captain said, "but sometimes people need to see things clearly." Outside the cockpit, Victor Halstead sat stiffly in his seat. Passengers nearby were already looking at him differently now, because the earlier confrontation hadn't happened quietly. They had all heard him. They had all seen it. And now they knew exactly who that quiet passenger really was. Inside the cockpit, the avionics systems continued humming steadily. The timing loop remained perfectly aligned. Navigation data stable, aircraft systems calm. The crisis had passed. Kovac gestured toward the door. "Go ahead," she said. Caleb nodded. He stepped out of the cockpit, and instantly felt dozens of eyes on him. Passengers across the first-class cabin were watching, some smiling, some nodding respectfully. A few even clapped softly again. The same space where he had been humiliated earlier now felt very different. As he walked past the wide leather seats, Victor Halstead looked up. For a moment, their eyes met. The executive opened his mouth slightly. But no words came out, because there was nothing left to say. Caleb simply continued walking, back toward economy, back toward his daughter. Behind him, the aircraft flew smoothly through the night sky. And for the first time since takeoff, the entire cabin understood exactly who the quiet man in the back rows really was. Caleb moved slowly down the aisle, the quiet murmur of the cabin following him like a soft wave. A few passengers in first class were still clapping lightly as he passed. Others simply nodded with a kind of respectful silence that hadn't been there earlier. The contrast wasn't lost on anyone. 30 minutes ago he had been standing in this same aisle, holding his daughter's hand while a powerful airline executive publicly insisted he didn't belong there. Now the same passengers were watching him walk back from the cockpit of the aircraft he had just helped stabilize. The plane hummed smoothly around them. No vibrations, no warning tones, just a steady rhythm of healthy engines carrying hundreds of people safely through the night sky. Caleb kept walking. He didn't slow down, didn't linger. He simply wanted to return to his seat. But just before he reached the curtain dividing first class from economy, a voice spoke up behind him. "Mr. Rourke." He paused. The voice belonged to Captain Mirala Kovac. She had stepped out of the cockpit and into the aisle behind him. Passengers nearby turned immediately. Kovac's voice carried calm authority. "I think the passengers deserve to hear one more thing." Caleb shifted slightly, uncomfortable with the tension, but he waited. The captain looked around the cabin. Earlier tonight, she said clearly, this passenger was asked to leave the first-class section. Several people exchanged glances. They remembered. Victor Halstead felt the words land like stones. Kovac continued. At the time, no one knew he had spent over a decade working on military avionics systems. More murmurs spread through the seats. The businessman across from Halstead leaned back slightly, shaking his head in quiet disbelief. "Tonight," the captain said, "when our aircraft encountered a serious avionics fault, Mr. Rourke recognized the problem from his seat in economy and helped us isolate it before it escalated." She paused. The silence that followed was deeper than before. His knowledge helped stabilize this aircraft. A ripple of applause began near the front row. Then another, and another. Within seconds, passengers across first class were clapping openly. Some even stood slightly in the aisle to watch. The applause traveled down the cabin, spreading into economy where people joined in without even knowing every detail. Lena looked up as the sound reached her row. Her face lit up. "That's my dad," she said proudly. The woman beside her laughed warmly. "I know." Up front, Victor Halstead remained seated. His hands rested stiffly on the armrests. He didn't clap. He couldn't. Because the entire moment was quietly dismantling the assumption he had made earlier. That wealth and status defined who belonged where. Captain Kovac let the applause settle before speaking again. "There's a lesson in aviation," she said. Passengers listened. It doesn't matter where someone is sitting on the aircraft. Her eyes moved briefly toward Halstead. "What matters is what they know when things go wrong." The words hung in the air for a moment. Then she nodded once to Caleb. "Thank you again, Mr. Rourke." Caleb gave a small, respectful nod back. "You're welcome, Captain." He turned again toward economy. As he walked through the curtain, the applause followed him a little further before gradually fading into quiet conversation. Passengers whispered about what had happened. Some replayed the earlier confrontation. Others simply shook their heads at the strange twist of events. Victor Halstead remained motionless in his seat for several seconds. The businessman across the aisle looked at him carefully. "Tough night," the man said. Halstead didn't answer. Because he understood something now that hadn't occurred to him earlier. The man he had dismissed had never needed first class to prove his worth. Meanwhile, in economy, Caleb reached his row. Lena jumped out of her seat the moment she saw him. "You fixed it," she said, wrapping her arms around him. He laughed softly. "I helped. That means you fixed it." He sat down beside her, finally relaxing for the first time since the problem had started. The aircraft continued its smooth journey through the night sky, engines steady, navigation stable, passengers calm. Lena leaned against his shoulder. "Dad? Yeah? You're kind of a hero now." Caleb smiled faintly. "I'm still just your dad." She thought about that. Then nodded as if that was even better. Behind them, the aircraft carried its passengers quietly across the darkness. But the story of what had happened on that flight, how a single father from economy had helped stabilize the plane after being thrown out of first class, would be remembered by everyone on board long after they landed. The aircraft began its gradual descent nearly an hour later. Cabin lights brightened slightly as the plane lowered through scattered clouds, the city ahead glowing like a field of stars beneath the night sky. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had completely changed. Passengers were relaxed again, but conversations kept circling back to the same subject. The quiet man from the economy, the avionics problem, the captain's announcement. People who had never spoken to each other before were now exchanging theories about what had happened inside the cockpit. A few passengers even glanced toward row 23 from time to time. Caleb noticed. He pretended not to. Lena, however, noticed everything. She leaned close to him and whispered, "They're all looking at you again." He chuckled softly. "They'll forget by tomorrow. I won't." Her answer made him smile. Up front, Victor Halstead sat rigidly in his seat as the aircraft lowered through its final descent path. The applause from earlier still echoed faintly in his memory, not because it had been loud, but because it had been deserved, and he had known it. The businessman across the aisle watched him quietly for a moment. "You know," the man said, "I think the captain handled that pretty well." Halstead exhaled slowly. Yes, she did. It was the first genuine agreement he had offered all evening. A few moments later, the intercom chimed again. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Kovac's voice returned calmly, "we've begun our final descent and should be landing shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened." Passengers buckled in. Outside the windows, the city lights rose closer as the aircraft glided toward the runway. In economy, Lena squeezed her father's arm again. "Do you think the captain will tell people again when we land?" Caleb shook his head. "No, kiddo. The important part's already over." "What part?" "Getting everyone home safely." She seemed satisfied with that answer. The plane lowered through another layer of clouds. Then the runway lights appeared ahead. The aircraft touched down smoothly. A gentle bump. Reverse thrust roared briefly. Then the engines eased again as the plane rolled along the runway and slowed. Passengers applauded lightly, something people often did after tense flights. But this time the applause carried a slightly different feeling. Relief, gratitude, and quiet respect. The aircraft taxied toward the terminal. When it finally stopped at the gate, the seatbelt sign chimed off. Passengers began standing, gathering bags from overhead bins. The usual rush toward the aisle began. But something unusual happened near the front of the plane. Several passengers in first class waited. Instead of pushing forward, they stood quietly, watching, because they knew someone from the back rows would be walking forward soon. In economy, Caleb lifted Lena's backpack and slung it over his shoulder. "You ready?" he asked. She nodded. They stepped into the aisle. As they began moving forward through the cabin, whispers followed again. Passengers smiled. A few nodded politely. Some even thanked him quietly as he passed. "Appreciate what you did. Glad you were on this flight." Caleb responded to each with the same small, humble nod. Nothing more. When he reached the curtain separating economy from first class, the aisle ahead cleared almost instantly. Passengers stepped aside, not out of obligation, out of respect. Victor Halstead stood near his seat holding his briefcase. When Caleb approached, the two men found themselves face to face once again. The moment stretched for a few seconds. Halstead cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. The words sounded unfamiliar coming from someone used to giving orders. Caleb looked at him calmly. "You were protecting your seat," he replied. Halstead shook his head. "No, I was protecting my assumptions." The honesty surprised even him. Lena looked between the two men curiously. Halstead noticed her watching. His voice softened slightly. "You must be proud of your father." Lena nodded immediately. "I always am." Halstead managed a small, humbled smile. "Good," he said. Caleb gave a polite nod. Then he continued walking toward the exit. The flight attendant at the door smiled warmly as they reached the front. "Thank you again," she said quietly. Caleb stepped onto the jet bridge with his daughter beside him. Behind them, passengers slowly followed. Inside the aircraft cabin, conversations continued. People were already retelling the story. The single father, the cockpit, the avionics fault, and the moment when the pilot walked out looking for help and found it in the most unexpected seat on the plane. The jet bridge felt quieter than the aircraft had. The steady hum of the plane faded behind them as Caleb and Lena walked slowly toward the terminal, the soft echo of footsteps filling the narrow corridor. Travelers from the flight followed at a respectful distance, many still glancing toward the quiet father and daughter ahead of them. Lena swung her backpack lightly. "You know," she said, "this is the coolest flight I've ever been on." Caleb laughed under his breath. "Most people wouldn't call avionics failures cool." "Well," she replied confidently, "most people didn't get to see their dad fix an airplane." He shook his head, amused. "I didn't fix it. I just helped the pilots find the problem. That still counts." They stepped into the terminal where the bright lights and distant announcements of arriving flights replaced the enclosed quiet of the aircraft. Passengers from their flight spread into the wide corridor. But something unusual happened again. A few travelers paused. Some offered quiet thanks. A couple shook Caleb's hand briefly before continuing toward baggage claim. Word had already spread through the cabin before landing. Now it followed them into the airport. One man approached with a smile. "Glad you were on that plane tonight," he said sincerely. Caleb nodded politely. "Me too." A moment later, Captain Mirella Kovac stepped into the terminal behind them. She had removed her pilot's cap, but her calm presence was unmistakable. She walked over and stopped beside Caleb. "I wanted to thank you one more time," she said. "You already did, not like this." Lena looked up at the captain with curiosity. "Are you the pilot?" Kovac smiled warmly. "I am." Lena straightened proudly. "My dad helps machines behave." The captain chuckled softly. "I noticed." Then she turned back to Caleb. "You know, most people would have stayed quiet after being treated the way you were earlier." Caleb shrugged slightly. "When you hear a problem you know how to fix, it's hard to ignore it. That's the kind of person aviation relies on," she replied. For a moment the three of them stood there while travelers passed around them. Then Kovac extended her hand. "If you ever miss working around aircraft, let me know. People with your ears are rare." Caleb shook her hand. "I'll keep that in mind." She nodded once, then headed off toward the crew exit. Lena watched her go. "Dad? Yeah? Do you think she meant that?" "Probably. Are you going to fix airplanes again?" He thought about the question. For years he had avoided returning to that world. Life had taken him down a quieter road, raising his daughter, fixing everyday machines, staying out of the spotlight. But tonight had reminded him of something. Skills didn't disappear. They waited. And sometimes they appeared exactly when people needed them most. "We'll see," he said. Lena seemed satisfied with that answer. They walked toward the exit together, blending back into the normal rhythm of the airport. Behind them, passengers from the flight continued telling the story. The moment the pilot left the cockpit. The quiet father who understood the problem before anyone else. And the strange twist of fate that placed the right person in the right seat, even if it wasn't first class. Caleb pushed open the terminal doors and stepped outside with Lena beside him. Cool night air greeted them. Cars moved steadily along the pickup lane, the city lights stretched across the horizon. Lena slipped her hand into his. "You know something?" "What?" "I think people are going to remember this flight for a long time," he smiled. "Maybe. But I'll remember something else," she said. "What's that?" that the guy they kicked out of first class turned out to be the most important passenger on the plane. Caleb squeezed her hand gently. Sometimes the world measures value with money, status, or titles. But machines and life had a different way of revealing truth. They revealed it when things went wrong. And the people who stepped forward quietly were the ones who mattered most. Before we wrap up, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what you thought about Caleb's story. And if you want another powerful story like this, ask me for the next title. Subscribe and don't miss our next story. The janitor they mocked in the hospital until the surgeon collapsed mid-surgery. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next? Security laughed at the poor single dad. Huh? Keep walking before I call someone who can make it worse. They laughed as security blocked the poor single dad at the barricade. They saw worn boots, a tired child, and a man they thought didn't belong near power. But he didn't argue, panic, or beg. Minutes later, the street would learn who they had mocked. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. Some people confuse appearance with worth, until truth humiliates arrogance. Before anyone saw the moment the president's motorcade stopped for the man security mocked, the truth was already standing in steel-toed boots, holding a little girl's hand like it was the only thing in the world that mattered. The guard at the outer barricade smirked like he'd been handed a joke. Behind him, polished SUVs rolled into formation beside the Civic Plaza, black paint gleaming under the sun. Metal barriers cut the avenue into zones of importance. One side belonged to officials, cameras, and people wearing badges clipped to tailored jackets. The other belonged to workers, delivery vans, and anybody expected to stay invisible. The man in the faded jacket didn't look invisible to his daughter. She held his hand with both of hers, backpack hanging crooked over one shoulder, looking up at him as if his answer would settle the whole world. Elias Mercer squeezed her fingers once and kept his voice even. He was tired enough to feel it behind his eyes, but there was no anger in the way he stood, only a stillness that made the laughter around him feel cheap. The lunch pail in his free hand was dented. His boots were dusty. The patch on his maintenance jacket had frayed at one corner. None of it explained the posture that hadn't learned how to wilt. He looked past the barricade, not at the insult, but at the line of temporary fencing, the concrete planters, the route markers sprayed near the curb. His gaze moved with quiet precision, as if the street were a page he already knew how to read. Leela shifted closer to his side. Her face had gone small and careful, the way children's faces do when they understand something hurtful is happening and don't yet know where to put it. That was the part that hit him. Not the guard's contempt, not the snickers from two contract officers near the press lane. It was seeing his daughter learn, in real time, how quickly strangers measured human worth by a pair of worn sleeves. He bent slightly, enough to bring himself nearer to her eye level. The plaza smelled like hot concrete, engine exhaust, and roasted nuts from a cart pushed blocks away from the perimeter. Sirens muttered in the distance. Helicopter blades thudded faintly overhead. "You stay right by me," he said. She nodded. "I am." That studied him more than anything else. Elias had spent the last 3 years building a life out of smaller rooms, tighter budgets, and promises he never let himself break. Up before dawn. Work orders all day. Pickup after school. Cheap dinners that still felt warm because Leela laughed over them. The city had given him a maintenance route through the government plaza because nobody in power noticed who kept the pipes, lights, and service corridors working beneath marble buildings. That was fine with him. Places like this often revealed more from underneath than they ever did from the front entrance. A woman in a tailored navy coat crossed the inner lane, speaking into an earpiece while agents adjusted positions around her. Chief Miranda Kent moved like the whole plaza belonged to her, shoulders square, jaw set, every glance sharp enough to cut. She took one look at Elias, then at Leela, then at the maintenance badge clipped to his chest, and dismissed them both with the efficiency of someone used to deciding which lives mattered in less than a second. Elias said nothing. But something at the far edge of the route tightened inside him. A barrier foot near the eastern curb sat at the wrong angle. Not much. Barely noticeable. Yet it was enough to interrupt the clean geometry of the perimeter. Beside it, a utility cover showed fresh scoring around one bolt. New scrape marks. Recent. The hair at the back of his neck rose before his mind finished naming why. He inhaled once, slow and deep. Beneath the diesel fumes and city heat, another scent seemed to flicker in memory, sharp and metallic, dragged from a place in his past he kept buried for his daughter's sake. Then the distant sirens grew louder. The president's motorcade was coming, and the street in front of Elias suddenly felt less like a road than a fuse. The guard was still grinning when the first black SUV rolled into view at the far end of the avenue. Sirens echoed between the glass towers surrounding the plaza, bouncing off steel and marble until the whole street vibrated with authority. Engines growled in a low, synchronized rhythm that felt almost mechanical, like a moving wall of power advancing toward the barricade. Elias Mercer didn't move. Leela leaned closer to his side, her small hand still locked around his fingers. "That's the president, right?" she whispered. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Are we supposed to be this close?" "Not usually." The guard overheard and snorted. "Don't worry, kid," he said, leaning on the metal barrier. "Your dad's not getting any closer than this. Nobody without clearance crosses here." Another officer nearby laughed under his breath. Maintenance guys always think their badges work everywhere. Elias said nothing. His eyes stayed on the street. The motorcade grew larger with every passing second, sleek armored vehicles gliding forward with deliberate precision. Secret Service agents stepped into position along the inner lane, hands resting near jackets, scanning rooftops and crowd lines. But Elias wasn't looking at the vehicles. His gaze was locked on the curbside infrastructure. That crooked barrier foot again, the utility plate beside it. Something about the spacing was wrong. Not loud wrong, not dramatic, just off. 3 inches, maybe 4. He shifted his weight slightly. The movement made the guard glance at him. "What part of stay back don't you understand?" the officer said. "I'm staying back," Elias replied calmly. His voice carried no irritation, no challenge, just fact. Leela looked up at him again. "You're thinking," she said. He blinked once. "What makes you say that?" "You get that face?" He almost smiled. Before he could answer, a sharp voice cut through the plaza. Clear the outer lane, Miranda Kent stepped forward, heels clicking on the pavement with military crispness. Her dark hair was pulled into a tight knot, expression carved from impatience and authority. She looked at Elias the same way someone looks at a coffee stain on a clean table. Why is this man still standing here? The guard straightened. He says he works maintenance. Kent's gaze flicked to the badge on Elias's chest, then to the lunch pail, then to Lila. "This perimeter closed 15 minutes ago," she said sharply. "Move them out." Elias nodded slightly. "We're leaving," he said. Kent didn't reply. She had already turned away, speaking into her earpiece. Motorcade entering Sector 2, confirm barricade alignment, agents hold positions. Her voice was clipped and efficient, everything about her projected control, except the barricade foot still sat crooked. Elias exhaled slowly. He crouched beside Leela, adjusting the strap on her backpack. "You remember the rule when we walk past busy streets?" he asked softly. "Stay on your right side," she said immediately. "And?" And hold your hand. Good. The motorcade was now only a block away. Sirens dropped in volume as the vehicles slowed, shifting from urgency to controlled glide. Something tightened deeper in Elias's chest. The utility plate again. Fresh scoring around one bolt. A faint vibration hummed through the concrete under his boots, not from the approaching engines, but from something else. He straightened slowly. The guard rolled his eyes. Still here? Elias didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer to the barricade, studying the base structure. The guard snapped upright. Hey. Back up. Elias pointed at the ground. That barrier wasn't installed like that this morning. The officer scoffed. You part of the security team now? No. Then move. Elias hesitated only half a second. Something underneath that plate shifted recently. The guard barked a laugh. Yeah? Maybe the wind moved it. A second officer chuckled. Maintenance guy thinks he's an engineer. Leela tugged gently on Elias's sleeve. Dad. He squeezed her hand again. I know. Behind them, pedestrians gathered behind temporary fencing, phones raised, waiting to film the presidential convoy. Camera crews adjusted tripods. Reporters whispered countdowns. Nobody noticed the crooked barrier. Nobody except the man security had just laughed at. The lead Secret Service SUV rolled toward the plaza intersection. Suddenly, the vehicle braked. Not a gradual stop. A sharp halt. The entire motorcade froze behind it in a chain reaction of armored steel. Agents stepped forward instantly, scanning the street. Kent's head snapped toward the convoy. What's happening? She demanded. An agent spoke urgently into his wrist mic. Possible obstruction near the barrier grid. Kent turned toward the curb, toward the crooked foot, toward the exact spot Elias had been staring at for the last minute. The guard beside him frowned. What the hell? Elias's jaw tightened. That vibration again. Faint, precise, mechanical. Leela felt his hand tense. Dad? His voice dropped to a whisper. Sweetheart, step back behind me. The air in the plaza changed. Agents spread outward in controlled arcs. Radios crackled. The press line went silent. And for the first time since the laughter started, Miranda Kent looked directly at Elias Mercer. If you're enjoying this story so far, make sure you subscribe with the bell on, because moments like what's about to happen next are exactly why these stories matter. Across the barricade, an agent crouched near the utility plate. He leaned closer, then froze. Command, he said into his mic. His voice had lost all casual tone. We may have a device. The plaza erupted into motion. Agents shouted commands. People were pushed back. Engines cut. And Elias Mercer felt the cold, unmistakable certainty settle in his chest. He had seen this pattern before, many times, in places far louder and far darker than a quiet American plaza. He exhaled once. Then stepped toward the barricade again. The guard grabbed his arm. Where do you think you're going? Elias didn't raise his voice, but his eyes had changed. Toward the problem, he said quietly. The guard's grip tightened around Elias's arm. Toward the problem? The officer repeated, You're not going anywhere near that. Across the barricade, agents were already forming a wider perimeter. Radios crackled with clipped urgency. The lead SUV's engine idled like a restless animal, while the rest of the motorcade sat frozen behind it in a line of silent armored steel. Leela pressed closer to Elias's side. What's happening? She asked softly. He kept his voice steady. Just stay behind me. Kent strode toward the barrier, heels striking the pavement in sharp beats. Her eyes locked onto the crouching agent near the utility plate. Report. The agent didn't look up. There's wiring under the plate, looks like an improvised device. We're pulling the convoy back. Kent swore under her breath. How did something like that get past the sweep? No one answered. Another agent waved the press line farther back. Reporters stumbled behind their barricade, cameras shaking as they tried to capture the sudden chaos. The guard beside Elias finally released his arm. You heard them, he said. Everyone moves back, but Elias didn't step away. His gaze remained fixed on the curbside, the crooked barrier foot, the scored bolt, the plate. And the way the agent hovering above it wasn't touching anything, just staring. Because he didn't know what he was looking at. Elias exhaled slowly. A faint hum vibrated through the concrete again. There it was, subtle, precise, mechanical timing. His stomach tightened with recognition. Sir, the guard snapped, move. Elias turned slightly toward him. That device isn't armed the way you think. The officer blinked. Excuse me? Kent heard it too. Her head turned sharply. What did you just say? Elias didn't raise his voice. That agent shouldn't touch the plate, he said calmly. A few nearby officers scoffed. You serious right now? One muttered. Kent stepped closer to the barricade. And how exactly would you know that? Elias hesitated for half a second. Not because he doubted himself, but because speaking meant reopening a door he'd spent years closing. Behind him, Lila's small hand tugged his sleeve again. Dad. He looked down at her. The fear in her eyes was quiet but unmistakable. That decided it. He crouched in front of her. Remember the rule when things get loud? He asked. She nodded. You stay right here and listen to the officers. Okay, he stood again. Kent was watching him now with open irritation. You have 5 seconds to step away from this barricade, she said coldly. Elias gestured toward the plate. That device was planted using the maintenance access under the barrier grid. An agent frowned. How would you? It's not pressure triggered, Elias continued calmly, and it's not a timer. Kent crossed her arms. Oh, this should be good, the guard next to him snorted. Let me guess, he said. You watched a documentary once. Elias ignored him. His eyes stayed on the utility cover. The vibration you're hearing isn't from the motorcade, he said quietly. It's a signal loop. That caught someone's attention. The crouching agent looked up. Signal loop? Elias nodded once. Remote trigger system. The plaza went still. Kent's expression hardened. You're speculating. No, Elias said. Then explain how you're so confident. He met her gaze. For the first time since the confrontation started, something in his posture shifted. Not aggression. Authority. Quiet. Unshakable. Because whoever built that device expects the bomb squad to follow standard removal procedure, the crouching agent slowly stood. What happens if we do? Elias pointed toward the barrier. The plate lifts, the loop breaks, and the trigger fires. Silence rippled through the officers. Kent's jaw tightened. You're telling me you understand the construction of an explosive device planted under a presidential route? Yes, and you expect me to believe that? He didn't answer immediately. The sirens in the distance faded as police closed surrounding streets. Helicopter blades thumped louder overhead. The plaza felt smaller by the second. Finally, Kent spoke again. Step away from the barricade, she said. Now, Elias looked back at the plate, then at the agent standing uncertainly beside it, then at Lila. His daughter stood exactly where he'd left her, watching him with the same steady trust she'd always had. That trust mattered more than the humiliation, more than Kent's suspicion, more than the guard's laughter. Elias took a slow breath. Then he stepped forward. The guard lunged again. Hey! Kent raised a hand. Stop! Everyone froze. She studied Elias carefully now, not dismissively, assessing. What's your name? She asked. Elias. Elias what? Mercer. Kent glanced at the badge on his jacket. Maintenance tech, that's the job I have. Her eyes narrowed. And the job you had before that? Elias didn't answer immediately. The crouching agent shifted uneasily. Chief, if he's right about the trigger loop, Kent held up a finger, still watching Elias. What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Mercer? He gestured toward the barricade again. That device can't be approached from above. Kent's voice cooled. And yet you seem very certain about that. I am. The plaza fell into a tense hush. Finally, Kent spoke again. You're either very brave, she said slowly, or very stupid. Elias looked back at the plate, then at the silent motorcade, then at the men and women who were waiting for someone to make the next decision. His voice stayed calm. I'm neither. Kent crossed her arms again. Then what are you? Elias Mercer answered quietly. The guy who knows how that bomb works. The words settled over the plaza like a sudden drop in temperature. The guy who knows how that bomb works? For a moment, nobody spoke. The helicopters thudded overhead, stirring dust along the barricades. Secret Service agents shifted positions with disciplined urgency, while officers forced the growing crowd farther back. News cameras tilted toward the curb, catching every tense movement. Miranda Kent studied Elias Mercer carefully now. The laughter was gone from her expression, but the suspicion remained. You're claiming expertise, she said. That's a serious statement near a presidential route. Elias didn't flinch. I know. Kent glanced toward the agent standing beside the utility plate. What do you see? The agent crouched again, careful not to touch the metal cover. Thin wiring beneath the plate looks like it's feeding into something inside the service channel, he said. But we can't confirm the trigger type without lifting it. Elias spoke before Kent responded. If you lift it, the signal loop breaks. The agent's head turned sharply. That's exactly what I just said, Elias added. Kent folded her arms tighter. Anyone can repeat a guess. Not a guess. Then what? Elias looked down at the barrier again, the crooked footing, the shaved bolt head, the vibration humming faintly beneath the concrete. Every piece of it formed a pattern his mind recognized instantly. He'd seen variations of it in places where the air smelled like burned metal and dust instead of city exhaust. Two-stage circuit, he said quietly. The crouching agent blinked. You can see that from here? Elias nodded once. The vibration is the transmitter. Kent frowned. What transmitter? Elias pointed toward the barricade line 20 feet down the curb. Secondary relay, several agents followed the direction of his finger. One of them moved toward the indicated barrier. Kent raised a hand immediately. Stop. The agent froze. Kent looked back at Elias. You expect me to trust the judgment of a man I've never met who wandered into a restricted security zone 10 minutes ago? No, Elias replied calmly. Kent's eyebrow lifted. Then what do you expect? That you listen long enough to keep someone from dying. The words landed harder than shouting would have. Behind the barricade, reporters leaned forward, trying to catch every detail. Police continued pushing civilians back from the perimeter. Leela stood quietly where Elias had told her to stay. Her eyes never left him. Kent noticed the child now. Her gaze lingered for a second longer than before. Then she turned back to Elias. You're saying this device was placed under the maintenance access, yes, and you know that because the bolts were replaced. Kent glanced at the plate again. They look intact to me. They're not, Elias said. One of them was shaved and reseated. The crouching agent leaned closer. A second later, he exhaled sharply. Chief, he's right. Kent's jaw tightened. That still doesn't explain how he knows the trigger configuration. Elias shifted slightly. His boots scraped faintly against the pavement. The sound carried a strange weight in the quiet. Remote signal loop, he repeated. Probably tied to a secondary transmitter down the barricade line. Kent glanced toward the barrier Elias had pointed out earlier. Then back at him. You're very confident, yes. And if you're wrong? Elias didn't hesitate. Then the bomb squad follows standard protocol and someone dies anyway. Silence again. The crouching agent spoke carefully. Chief, the bomb team is still 3 minutes out. Kent's fingers drummed once against her arm. 3 minutes. 3 minutes with the presidential convoy sitting directly above a possible explosive. 3 minutes while cameras rolled and hundreds of people watched from behind barricades. 3 minutes for a remote trigger operator to decide the moment. Kent looked at Elias again. You still haven't explained something. What's that? How a maintenance technician knows anything about explosive trigger systems. Elias exhaled slowly. The smell of heated pavement drifted through the air. His mind flickered through images he rarely allowed himself to revisit. Dust storms, desert roads, metal shells buried under broken asphalt. Places where hesitation cost lives. He met Kent's gaze. I used to disarm them. Kent didn't respond. The agent beside the plate did. You what? Explosive ordnance disposal, Elias said. The plaza seemed to contract around the words. Kent studied him again, this time not as an inconvenience, as a variable. How long? 10 years. The crouching agent straightened fully now. Chief, if that's true, Kent raised a hand. Her eyes remained locked on Elias. Why are you working city maintenance? Elias didn't answer immediately. Behind him, Leela shifted slightly. He glanced back at her. That single look told Kent more than any explanation. Family, loss, life rebuilt. Kent inhaled slowly. Then she turned toward the crouching agent again, confirmed the bolts. The agent leaned down, examining the plate with greater care. A few seconds passed. Then he nodded. He's right. Kent looked back at Elias Mercer, the man security had laughed at. The man wearing a frayed maintenance jacket, the man who claimed to understand the bomb beneath the president's motorcade. Her voice dropped lower. If you're lying, you're interfering with a federal security operation. Elias nodded. I understand, and if you're telling the truth. She glanced toward the frozen motorcade. Then you're the only person here who knows what that thing will do next. Elias looked down at the utility plate again. The faint vibration pulsed through the pavement once more. His jaw tightened. We don't have long, he said quietly, because whoever planted it, he pointed toward the barricade line, is probably watching us right now. Elias's quiet words hung in the air like a warning nobody wanted to hear. Miranda Kent slowly turned her head, scanning the line of barricades stretching down the curb. Beyond them stood dozens of people, reporters clutching cameras, officers repositioning patrol units, civilians pressed behind fencing with phones raised high. Any one of them could be watching. Any one of them could be waiting. Kent exhaled sharply through her nose. Everyone freeze the perimeter, she ordered into her radio. Nobody moves anything on that barricade line without my authorization. Agents immediately echoed the command. Perimeter hold, barrier hold, no contact with grid. The crouching agent stepped away from the utility plate carefully, hands lifted slightly as if the pavement itself might bite. Elias kept his eyes on the metal cover. The vibration came again. Subtle. Regular. Like a distant heartbeat buried in concrete. He'd heard that rhythm before. A transmitter loop designed to confirm the device was still armed, meaning the operator was still listening. Kent folded her arms. You said a secondary relay might be along the barricade line. Yes. Where? Elias pointed 20 feet down the curb again, toward a barrier post sitting slightly farther from the others. That one. Several agents followed his line of sight. One of them spoke quietly. "It does look slightly offset." Kent's gaze narrowed. "Offset doesn't mean explosive." "No," Elias agreed. "But that's where I'd hide the receiver." Kent studied the barrier again. "And you'd know that because—" Elias didn't answer immediately. The air smelled faintly of overheated engines now. Somewhere behind the motorcade, an officer shouted instructions to reposition a patrol unit. He finally said, "Because it's the safest place." Kent frowned. Safest for who? For the person triggering it, the crouching agent looked back toward the barricade Elias had indicated. "If he's right about the relay—" Kent cut him off. "We don't know that yet." Elias's voice stayed calm. "You don't need to move it." Kent turned back toward him. "Then how do we confirm?" He pointed to the base of the barrier. "Look for a micro-antenna." The agent blinked. "A what?" "Small receiver node," Elias said. "Usually no bigger than a pen tip." Kent's eyes flicked toward the barricade again. Agent Morales— "Yes, Chief." Approached slowly. Morales nodded and began moving down the curb. Each step seemed louder than the last. The entire plaza watched. News cameras zoomed in. Civilians held their breath. Leela's fingers curled around the strap of her backpack as she stared at her father. Morales knelt beside the barrier. He leaned closer. Silence stretched across the street. Then he spoke quietly into his mic. "Chief." Kent's voice sharpened. "What do you see?" Morales angled his flashlight toward the base of the metal post. "There's something here." Kent stepped forward. "What kind of something?" Morales leaned closer, then slowly turned his head toward Elias. "A micro-antenna." The plaza erupted into murmurs. Kent stared at the barrier, then at Elias, then back at the device beneath the utility plate. For the first time since the crisis began, doubt cracked her certainty. "You identified both components from 30 feet away," she said. Elias shrugged faintly. "It's not complicated if you've seen the design before." Kent's voice hardened again. "You keep saying that, because it's true." Morales stood slowly. "Chief, if the relay and trigger loop are both active," Kent finished the sentence for him, "then the bomb squad opening that plate would complete the circuit." Morales nodded grimly. "Yes." A heavy silence fell again. The motorcade sat frozen behind them. Secret Service agents shifted positions nervously. Somewhere a helicopter banked overhead, its blades chopping the air into heavy waves. Kent's gaze returned to Elias. "You're telling me the entire presidential route is sitting over a device that can't be disarmed by standard protocol?" "Yes, and you figured that out in under 2 minutes, yes." Kent studied him carefully. There was no arrogance in his posture, no pride, just focus, which somehow made him more unsettling than if he'd been bragging. "Why didn't you tell security this earlier?" she asked. Elias gave a small, tired smile. They were busy laughing. Kent's jaw tightened slightly. The guard who had grabbed Elias earlier suddenly found the pavement very interesting. Kent ignored him. Instead, she took one slow step closer to Elias. "Mr. Mercer." "Yes, if what you're saying is correct." She glanced toward the plate again. "Then this situation requires a very different approach." Elias nodded. "It does. And that approach would be?" He gestured toward the barricade line. "First, we isolate the relay." Kent frowned. "That means moving the barrier." "Not removing it." Morales looked uneasy. "That still risks triggering the signal loop." Elias shook his head. "Not if you interrupt the transmission first." Kent crossed her arms again. "And how exactly do you propose doing that?" Elias lifted his dented lunch pail slightly. Kent blinked. "You're joking." "No, you're telling me the solution to a presidential explosive threat is inside a maintenance lunchbox?" Elias didn't answer immediately. Instead, he unclipped the worn metal latch. The lid opened with a soft metallic click. Inside were tools, simple ones, wrenches, a voltage tester, coiled wire. Kent stared. You expect me to believe you can neutralize a bomb with plumbing tools? Elias closed the lid halfway again. They're not plumbing tools. Kent folded her arms tighter. Then what are they? He looked back toward the utility plate, then toward the relay barrier, then toward the silent motorcade, and finally at Miranda Kent. They're the only tools here that won't trigger the device. He paused, then added quietly, and we're running out of time. If this moment already has you on the edge of your seat, subscribe with the bell on, because the next decision is going to change everything. Miranda Kent stared at the dented lunch pail like it had personally offended her. You're asking me to trust national security to a toolbox, she said flatly. Elias didn't react to the tone. I'm asking you to keep that plate closed until the signal stops, he replied. Behind them, the plaza remained frozen in controlled chaos. Agents held their positions. The motorcade idled silently. Reporters whispered into cameras while officers forced the last civilians farther from the barricades. Kent's eyes flicked toward the relay barrier again. Agent Morales still stood beside it, careful not to touch the metal post. If that antenna is